Tonight's review, Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis.
Hey everybody, it's Emily from Telltale. How y'all doing today? So Greg and I are going to be doing a review of Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. It's a short story, quick synopsis. It's about a young man who is kind of the breadwinner of his household, wakes up one day and he's a giant bug. No explanation. Just wakes up from strange dreams. He's like a giant bug. Cockroachy kind of thing, I guess. So, of course, in the story, his family is absolutely distraught that he's suddenly a bug. They aren't even sure that he is one, but of course he can't speak, so no communication. He watches his family kind of have to pick up where he left off. The reason he is the breadwinner of the household was because he was working to pay off some debt that his parents had, and he was under the impression that they were too old to work and too feeble. Kind of throughout the story, he ends up realizing, not even realizing, he's just watching his parents take on jobs and his young sister, take on jobs and rent out their home, rent out rooms in their home, things like that. He has this perception that they're all just exhausted and really, really tired. They become more and more cold towards him. They still take care of him, they still feed him, but over time, they care less about him. So eventually, he kind of stops eating and no one notices. Falls into a depression. He ends up, spoiler alert, passing away. Just because he's given up on the kind of life he's had. He's been abused at points by his parents. He actually is suffering from a really bad injury at one point in the story because his father, when he tried to come out of his room, his father decided to throw something at him and it got lodged in his back and no one cared to remove it. So it festered. So we don't know if it's a combination of him giving up on life or if he just had a really bad infection and it just made him feel worse and worse and worse and he lost his appetite and things like that. It could have been a combination of both. It could be one or the other. Ultimately, he passes away. And you kind of watch his family decline in care for him over time, which is really, really sad. I enjoyed the story for the mystery of it. It was very sobering, though, and very depressing that the family just kind of loses love for him because they're not quite sure that's still their son because they didn't watch the transformation happen. They just barged into his room one day because he was late for work and there was a giant bug there. You know? So they are not fully convinced that it's Gregor, their son, but at the same time, they care for him to a degree. They're repulsed, of course, by his existence, but they don't get rid of him. At certain points, for a while at the beginning, they feed him, they clean his room, they take care of, all those things, but over time, they do it less and less and less, and they don't pay attention to whether he's eaten or not. They just kind of put food out and sweep it up later, kind of at a regular time. There's, of course, a lot of drama. People who come in and out of the house end up figuring out that there's this giant bug living there, including some of the renters, which ends up blowing up in the parents' faces when they're trying to get extra money to support themselves and things like that. One of the things I appreciated and found kind of interesting with this story is that the main character, Gregor, when he first wakes up, is in full denial that he's a bug now. Full denial. I could still function. I still have He seems almost not to care that he's a bug suddenly. He's like, well, life has to go on. Like, it's either he's in denial or he's settled into it so well that he's like, well, I better try and get up for work and try to figure out how to use these legs and use this body. So that was really interesting and very amusing at the beginning of the story. It proceeds to get more and more heartbreaking as he settles into his new body. And he still has human emotions and feelings, but they're constantly being misinterpreted when he puts them into action. Like, he wants to approach his sister and comfort her, or, let her know that she's appreciated, but his sister thinks it's an attack. His family can't bear the sight of him. So his mom and sister come in one day to clean his room, but his mother sees him, has an asthma attack, and nearly chokes to death. Kind of stuff, because he's doing things that are human. Like, I want to be near my family. I want to be seen by my family. I want to spend time with my family, because he still feels love for them. But over time, his family's coldness towards him becomes more and more apparent. While him passing away in the end is really, really sad, it's one of those storylines where you almost need him to at the end. You have to appreciate that his life is no longer worth living in his case. And so you kind of have to respect the fact that, yes, him passing away kind of ultimately has to be the thing that happens, because he can no longer function in his family as he wants to. He can no longer function in society as he wants to. He doesn't leave his room, like, at all, hardly, just because his family's so repulsed by seeing him. He doesn't want to be seen by others. There's this huge conflict going on about the way things appear. And I think that's very telling to the kind of family that he has, that it's about the way things appear, which is probably, like, it makes you suspect, is that how they got into debt? Is that how he got into the situation he did? Because ultimately he was trying to pay off his parents' debt, which, in our day and age, we wouldn't think of that to be our responsibility. We'd be like, oh, our parents' debt is our parents' debt. We're going to take care of our own. But because he was part of the household, he took on that task and kind of became the breadwinner of the family. So you wonder if this whole theme of the way things appear is what got him into his position in his family in the first place, and if he was truly appreciated for it or not, or if he was ever appreciated at all. So, or if, humans are so easy to forget to appreciate and take things for granted that when circumstances change, is it really worth acknowledging the appreciation anymore? So there's a lot of really interesting family dynamic and questions in this one. I enjoyed it, even though it's depressing. I tend to like tragedy, and the world building in this is just a house, but it's really well described. His position in his family is really well described. Another thing I really found interesting about this book is the change in the family over time. Not only did they become more cold towards Gregor's condition and towards Gregor himself, because not just their uncertainty, but they're repulsed by the fact he's a giant bug. But the more cold they become towards Gregor, the more self-sufficient they become. They all get jobs, they all start making money, they start renting out rooms, they start doing all these things to take on what Gregor had already taken on as the breadwinner of the household. And as they do, they become more cold towards his circumstances. That's when they start not caring as much. I don't know if that was done intentionally or not. Like, I can understand if it was done intentionally for the sake of they're tired because they're all working now. And his parents are older, and his sister, while young, had never had a job before. So she's kind of, breaking into this brand new. And so you wonder, is it because they're tired, or is it because they don't need him anymore, that they become more and more cold towards him and less grateful for what he had done for them to support their family and pay off that debt? I don't get to answer that question. Only Franz Kafka can. But it's just an interesting dynamic, so I highly recommend this as a read. This is a pretty pivotal short story. It's very popular. It's a classic for sure. It's very timeless. A lot of very timeless themes. So I highly recommend it. I hope you guys enjoy reading it.
Hi, so it's my turn. And The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. A lot has been said about this story over the last century. Since it was written, I forget the exact year, I think it was 1915. I think it was the exact same year as Herland was published, that this was published. Let me know if I'm mistaken. Make comments. Correct me if I get these facts wrong, but I believe it was 1915. It's about a guy who wakes up one morning and he's a giant dung beetle, a giant cockroach. So The Metamorphosis is just a short story, but this is my book of it. They made a book of it by having 70% of this book filled with critical evaluations, people discussing the story. And I didn't read most of that, but I did read the introduction. And the author of this introduction makes a good point that Kafka was talking about how society kind of treats creative people. Any of you who are involved in creative activities, you know that your friends and family look at it like it's just playing around. It's not important. It's fluff. It's stupid. It's wasting your time. It's you just having fun. And it's not a serious endeavor. And so somebody like Kafka, who makes the decision that he wants to be a professional writer, professional painter, a Hollywood director, graphic designer, any of that stuff, people look at you like you're crazy, like you need to go out and get a real job. That's the attitude of our society, and that was the attitude in Kafka's day. You were expected to become a doctor or a lawyer or go into government or something like that. And so when you come home and announce that you want to be an artist, family and friends look at you like you suddenly morphed into some kind of weird shape, something from another planet. This can't be real. This can't be a real human being. He's crazy. He's off his rocker. He needs to have some sense knocked into him. That's the kind of attitudes that you deal with when you want to be a creative person. Even though when you're young, people do encourage creativity in children. There's all kinds of art contests for kids and writing contests for kids, all kinds of opportunity for young people to display their creativity. But then when they hit 21, they're supposed to go and work at 7-Eleven and make money and not have any thoughts about doing something greater with their lives. It's unfortunate. It's a very unfortunate way that our society is. And that's what the guy who wrote the introduction to this edition of Kafka's Metamorphosis, that's what he was thinking the story is all about. And I think that's a sensible interpretation of what Kafka was writing. It is also taken to be kind of a general description of a person who is feeling rejected and isolated and possibly even is suicidal, possibly has psychological problems. I don't think this was the case with Kafka. He may have preferred being alone. He may have been a loner. He may have been kind of quiet and distant, but I don't think he was off his rocker. I don't think he was in need of psychological help. I think Kafka was just wanting to express this creative side of himself. He had these ideas for these books and he wanted to write them. He really didn't even want them published. He just felt a need to do these books. And his books are very different from anybody else's. Imaginative wise, I would put him on the same level as Lovecraft, but Lovecraft is a very different kind of creative. Lovecraft is more pulp, magazine, horror, fiction, where Kafka is a completely different creature altogether. He doesn't fit into anything but the surrealist category. The story is brilliant. There's nothing I would change about it. It is a perfect story. The description of how the family kind of gives up on him and goes their own way, and before his change, they relied on him. After his change, they acted like he was dead to them, and they went off and just gave up on him and did their own thing. A lot of people go through that kind of thing of becoming isolated from their own families and friends and such because of decisions they make, because of whatever is going on in their life that makes them different from the accepted norm. And of course, what is normal? Point to something and say that that's what is normal. There's nothing that's really normal, but people have this concept of this normalcy in our society, and that's what we're all supposed to aspire to. But that concept of normalcy is pretty dull and boring, and if we want to rely on that to move our society forward, we're going nowhere. We need the exceptional people. We need the people like Kafka, like Einstein, like Hitchcock, like Da Vinci, who are willing to do the things that nobody else can imagine a person spending their life doing. And by doing so, they make all of us better. But the rest of us are just riding their coattails. They are the ones who truly accomplish something, not the rest of us. The rest of us are just going to work and slaving away every day and coming home and making supper and going to bed. And we're not accomplishing much. We're maintaining the status quo. It's those great, exceptional people. They're the people that make all of humanity great. So why do they become ostracized? Why are they the ones that have to suffer the indignities of the rest of us, saying that they're not normal, that they're crazy, that they're out of their head, that they're not living in reality? No, they're not living in reality. They're making a new reality, which is better than the reality before. But we don't seem to ever accept that. And I think that's what Kafka's really getting at here, is that the world needs those people who are willing to be different and willing to throw away who they are, throw away their lives in pursuit of that passion that they have for something: painting, writing, movies, science, whatever it may be. Those are the people that make us great. And those are the people that should be celebrated, but we don't. We push them aside and treat them like dung beetles. And with that, I'll bring this to a close and say good night. We'll see you next Friday at 6 p.m. I hope you enjoyed this.